For the European states and their rulers, the Ottomans' way of life was met with violent rejection and incomprehension as to how it was possible to live like that. In particular, this applied to harems. Europeans were accustomed to live like everyone else, that is, they married for the continuation of the family and had mistresses if there was a need for feelings. But children born to mistresses could not be considered official heirs. The Ottomans had a different way of doing things. Wives, concubines, favorites, sisters, slaves and maids lived in harems. That is, on the female half of the house, all representatives of the fair sex, who were in the care of a man, lived together. According to the Quran, a Muslim could have up to 4 wives and as many concubines as he could provide. The harems of the rulers of the Ottoman Empire always amazed with their size. They could have up to 300 concubines alone, and the total number of concubines sometimes exceeded several thousand. In the seraglio of the Sultan brought slave girls from all over the world, choosing only the most beautiful and elegant. Circassians, girls of Slavic nationality and from the Caucasus, were especially successful. All this was not in vain. All girls were characterized by good health and external attractiveness. Therefore, the sultans always had a lot of children. The birth of each child was considered a national holiday. A few weeks before the birth, Falid Sultan began preparations for this joyful event. The room where the concubine was to give birth had to be prepared in a special way. The room was draped with expensive fabrics and decorated with jewelry, and a cradle was brought there for the baby, corresponding to its special status. The cradle was all gilded and decorated. The bedding was also of the best quality. They did not forget about the dowry for the baby. They sewed clothes for him from the softest cotton. By the way, why were women of Slavic or Caucasian origin valued most of all in harems? All because they had stronger health and good heredity by nature, and therefore the child had more chances to grow up and mature. An important rite of preparation for childbirth was a ritual of protection from the evil eye and spoilage. A box with the Quran and several handkerchiefs with sesame seeds inside were brought to the room. All this was placed in a certain sequence all over the room. The gifts for the midwife and the young mother-to-be were not forgotten. After the birth of the child, the whole population of the capital learned about the joy of the Sultan. In honor of the birth of a boy, cannons were fired 7 times, girls 3 times. It lasted for 5 days. Special people traveled all over the city, informing the subjects of the Sultan about the birth of a son or daughter of the Sultan. In every street of the capital stood trays with treats for the common people. Ibi Kadin, the midwife, at this time conducted a ritual to remove spoilage and evil eye. The baby was put to sleep with salt, rubbed with ash on the forehead, and honey was applied to the lips. After that, the child was taken to the palace in separate rooms, which were allocated to his mother after childbirth. Now the concubine received a special status and privileges. 5 days after the birth of the baby, other inhabitants of the palace came with gifts with the mother and child to congratulate them. After that, simple days filled with domestic chores began. The concubine was released from her previous duties. Now her main task was to deal with the upbringing of her daughter. The title of sultaness imposed certain obligations on the little girl. She had to learn obedience and patience, as well as get used to the idea that her father was always right and free to dispose of her fate at his discretion. The concubine had many servants and nannies to help her take care of the girl. The young sultaness was fed with milk until she was about 2 years old. If the mother did not have milk, a nurse was engaged. The ritual of weaning from the mother's breast was also arranged with all kinds of splendor. Before the ritual ablution in the hammam, the baby was covered with special oil. However, the privilege of becoming a mother to the daughter of the sultan had its negative aspects. This meant that from now on the girl would devote herself completely to the child, and the way to the sultan's chambers was forbidden for her. The only exceptions were those concubines who were able to achieve the title of favorite and special sympathy of the sultan. In this case, they could still expect to receive a repeated invitation to the Lord's salvet and even give birth to another child by him. The young mother was engaged in the upbringing and education of her child until the age of 4, told him stories, initiated him into the subtleties of palace etiquette, and taught him how to behave properly with his father Sultan and grandmother Valide. On the daily walks of the daughter or son of the Sultan was necessarily accompanied by a nanny or eunuch. The little sultans were given a certain amount of money to spend every day. Clothes for little princesses were made of velvet, brocade and other expensive fabrics that emphasized their special status. The division of clothes by types of colors did not exist then. Girls could wear both pink colors and blue. The same applied to the little shehzades, but the kitchen for the heirs of the sultan was quite unpretentious. Tea and sherbets were served to little princes and princesses. Porridge, soups, roast meat, and all kinds of rice dishes were prepared for them. Sweets were represented by jams, different jellies, pastries and rahat lukum. When they reached the age of 4, teachers were chosen for the sultans and shehzades, who were engaged in their further education. They were taught Arabic language, reading and writing, history, culture, and were taught to play different musical instruments. The education lasted until the princesses reached the age of 14 to 16. Then their heads were covered with yashmak, and it was considered that the sultaness was ready for marriage. Preparation for marriage consisted in the fact that the girls were taught the art of seduction of the future spouse. By the way, some of them were engaged from birth, and future bridegrooms had to wait for 10 to 15 years until the girl grows up and matures. Candidates for husbands were selected by the sultan himself. Feelings were not taken into account here. The main condition was the usefulness of the man for the Ottoman Empire. And even if a man was already married, it was not an obstacle for the ruler. Sultanship could only be the first wife, so a man had to divorce his wife to take the daughter of the ruler as his wife. For some it was considered an honor, for others a heavy burden. After all, being the sultan's son-in-law was not easy. Without his wife's permission, he could not take another wife into the house or have a concubine. A man also had no right to divorce. He became an eternal debtor and servant of the sultan. True, the dowry for such a bride was always rich. The sultanship was entitled to jewelry, land, a lot of servants. Huge sums of money were spent on the wedding. But only after the sultaness got married, her life changed, and not for the better. From now on, she was obliged to stay at home, give birth to children and honor her husband. And if after some time in the relationship did not come to a turning point, when there were feelings of sympathy and respect for each other, such a life became dull and devoid of joy. Of course, the sultanship could ask her father to release her from her obligations to her husband and divorce her. But no one would allow her to stay alone, and she would have to marry again. And where is the guarantee that the next husband would be better than the previous one?